Hello, IHH listeners. I am back, and today I have a real doozy for you. If you've been itching for another cult story, well, buckle up. Because while it's not the whole Krugersdorp, aka Devilsdorp saga, this one is also pretty far out there, with arguably more unknowns and the court cases still playing out to this day. We're going to the Eastern Cape town of Ngcobo and back to 2018 to delve into the bizarre story of the Mancoba Seven Angels Ministry, which includes doomsday cult, family feuds, and not one but two Wild West-style shootouts with police. Just a quick word on names for clarity. I'm going to be talking about Ngcobo, the town, and Mancoba, the family behind the church/cult. But before we get into it, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine, or better yet, I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Cool, so I'll start. So my name is Meliswa Meli Sitwele. I am from Ngcobo. I was born and bred there. So I grew up in Ngcobo and lived there until I was 14 years old. Ngcobo is a very small town on the R61 between Ofimbaba or Queenstown and Umtata. So if you are on your way to Queenstown or if you are on your way to Umtata, Ngcobo is a small town that you will pass one street. There might be like two streets behind or so, and lots of gravel road. But it's very small, but it's a significant town because, Walter Sisulu is from Ngcobo. Clarkbury High School, where Mandela and Sisulu went, is in Ngcobo. Evelyn Masse is from Ngcobo. But it's a very poor town as well, because I think it's one of those old towns in the Transkei where there wasn't really a lot of economic activity happening. So if you look at places like Butterworth or Queenstown, there were farms, there were firms, there was a lot of economic activity happening, but in Ngcobo, there's just been like a lot of farming. People were farming, agriculture, planting their gardens, and therefore that's why there isn't a lot of economic activity happening even right now. It's a beautiful town, beautiful rolling hills, valleys, mountains. Apparently there's some rock art as well, but the town itself is not in the best of conditions. And I always joke to people that Ngcobo has looked the same since I was a kid. There's like literally no high-rise building. There's nothing new that has happened in the last 30 years that I can see.
You go back every year, don't you? Because you've got family there.
I go back, every year because I've got family. And I sometimes go in March as well for Easter and sometimes in September or whenever there's something that's happening at home. So I do go twice or three times a year.
Okay. So I know the sound there isn't fantastic. We muddle through with the Zoom that we have. But I think we can make it out. If you did struggle to hear that, the summary is that this is me chatting to Meliswa Sitwele, who grew up in Ngcobo. Millie and I worked together in Johannesburg years ago. These days, that company that we work for is a massive communications firm and local success story. But back then, we were about 8 of us working out of a converted house adjacent to the business owner's home. And it was the kind of small office where your co-workers become your friends. I remember Millie talking so fondly of her hometown, this little 1 or 2 road village in the Eastern Cape. And I come from a place like that too. Well, my mum lives in a village in the Eastern Cape that I've always thought of as home, even though I grew up in the town next door to that. Anyway, I'm getting off the point. Millie spoke about her hometown, this place of beauty, but also immense poverty and need. Millie and I both left that company eventually, and I went into journalism, and she climbed the ropes in communications and social media, and is today a bit of a rising star within a major blue-chip company. We stayed friends though, engaging mostly via social media, and when I started planning the story that I'm about to tell you, she immediately sprang to mind. In that clip, Meliswa tells us about the history of her town, and also the lack of economic development in Ngcobo, how it stayed virtually the same since she was little. She also speaks about how beautiful the surrounding area is, how close the community is. But there is another side to Ngcobo. In fact, sadly, it's earned a bit of a reputation as a dangerous place. That's something that I asked Millie about too in our chat.
It's got bad crime statistics, and I don't know why, and I don't know how. I suppose maybe it's poverty thing. Maybe people are despondent. Maybe the young people don't have anything to do. Because, like I said, it's a small town, but there are lots of people in the villages that are around it, and I think it goes back to when we were children. Because Ngcobo, it's got a Xhosa name called Ngcobo, which is Ngcobo, the place of thieves. So I always ask my grand, I even said to her, who was the first thief in Ngcobo? Who gave us such a bad cred? And no one knows. But I think back then it was the people were stealing cattle, they were stealing sheep, they were stealing cars and whatnot when we were growing up. So we've had that rap for the longest time. And I think that now the crime stats are just keep continuing and continuing, because people are just like, we're in this place, we don't have much to do, let's just steal. So that's the bad rap that we have, which is rather unfortunate. I'm from there as well, but you won't find me wandering in town at night because I'm scared. Even in my own village, my grandmother would be like, you can't just go out at night because now it's scary because of the crime. But definitely during the day, it's a safe place. It's a nice place to be, and people are friendly. But the crime makes it super scary.
The fact is that the murder rate in Ngcobo area is double the already high national average. To put a figure to that, between 2008 and 2018, an average of 73 people were killed in the tiny village of Ngcobo every year. Suffice it to say that even by South African standards, violent crime rates in the area are high. And while I'd never want to say that people are used to it, or it's a fact of life, well, we can say that the people of Ngcobo have definitely seen some shit. That said, there's really nothing that could have prepared anyone for the events that took place on the 21st of February 2018, which is where this episode focuses. When I first reached out to Millie and asked her to chat to me about Ngcobo, she said she wanted to be sure that I understood she wasn't an expert in this case. And I assured her that that wasn't what I was looking for, just local insight, which she does have in spades. She also has something else. Memories of encountering the group that I mentioned earlier, the Mancoba Seven Angels Church, and hearing rumors about the 7 brothers at the core of the group. Yes, 7 brothers, 7 angels, you see where they are going with this. They were a local oddity at first, an insular group who kept to themselves and mostly stayed under the radar, until one day the residents woke up to find their beautiful mountain had literally been used as a canvas by the church to prophesize and proselytize. Here's Millie again.
When we were growing up, the Mancoba church has always been around, right? But they didn't have a base. They didn't have a base. And when we were growing up in my area, they used to come and they would pitch a tent in one of the families there and they'd have church. And I think I must have been like 11 or 12. But I always remember how none of the people that went to that church went to school. So we would always go. We'd all go to school and nobody went to school from that church. And we always ask, why don't you guys go to school? If we ever got a chance to talk to them, we're like, no, Jesus didn't go to school, whatever. We are not supposed to go to school. So they would go and pitch a tent in this family home, and that was that. And I think when I was about 14, so I left Ngcobo at 14 to go live in East London, and I think they also left. And then they came back like a couple of years ago. And I heard that they were now, they had this house there by the mountain and they were living there. But like no one who's closely surrounded to me would go to that church. So I don't even know if members of that congregation were people from Ngcobo or were they people that had just followed that cult. And, it was always like this hush-hush vibe about people that that go to that church, that live there, that take their provident funds and they cash their pensions and they go give them to these people. But there's never been like a face to say, Kate goes to this church and I know Kate. Well, in my instance, in any case. But then I think the uproar kind of happened when they now wrote this big ass sign on the mountain. And that mountain is visible from my house. I think if you see the pictures I post on social media, I can see that mountain from home. And literally one morning, my grandsons, they woke up and there was a sign by the mountain. And I think they went and they protested in town a bit, but it seemed that these boys were quite connected. So nothing would ever really happen around, getting the church shut down until that big bust that happened. So that's as far and as much as I know about that stuff. And it just seems that they were quite connected with the law enforcers.
The words written on the mountain face appeared in 3 groups. The middle group is just sort of nonsensical exclamations, reading Jehovah, God, and angel forces. Close to that, on the right-hand side, there is a Xhosa bit which translates to the word of the Lord is everlasting. A little further apart, to the left, if you're facing the mountain, and I will try find an image of this to put on social media, but to the left it reads, the end of 1,260 days, it's a new beginning. 1,260 days is a reference to the Bible, specifically 2 passages in Revelation. First, Revelation 11:2-3 says, the Gentiles will trample on the holy city for 42 months, and I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And then Revelation 12:6 says, the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might have been taken care of for 1,260 days. We don't exactly know what was meant by the third bit of graffiti. I personally read it as a longer version of the end is nigh. With hindsight, it's definitely a harbinger. But for now, it's just an eyesore for the locals. Another reason to be suspicious of the growing group who have set up a compound at the foot of the mountain. If we zoom in on Mancoba Seven Angels Ministry, past the compound's wire fence, there are several buildings, including corrugated iron shacks, housing for the church's many members. A number of luxury cars are parked inside, but aside from a handful of members, the majority of people living there never set foot off the premises. It's certainly clear to the community of the area that there are some dodgy and perhaps even dangerous things going on within. But despite raising their concerns at various points, the authorities seem to have done very little to address them. But put a pin in that, because I'm going to come back to it later. The graffiti, scrawled meters high across this landmark, may have been the Seven Angels' first brush with national notoriety, but it isn't anything compared to what was to come. This is It Happened Here, Season 2, Episode 2, and I can tell you for free that my original working title of this episode was Profit for Profit, until I realized that wordplay sadly only works on paper. So, this episode is entitled Angels, Demons and Thieves, the Mancoba Seven Angels Massacre. It's February 21st, 2018, and just after midnight, when 3 vehicles pull up outside the Ngcobo police station. One of them is a police van, but the gunmen that climbs out are anything but police. They head into the station, and within seconds, gunfire shatters the quiet calm of a small village police station in the middle of the night. In the initial volley, 2 police officers are shot, another is forced along with 2 colleagues to open the police station's gun safe. There, the intruders help themselves to multiple weapons, 2 shotguns, a rifle, various pistols, around 10 in total. While this is going on, there are gunshots ringing from outside the station as well. By the time the attackers march the officers outside, one of the police vans is already smeared with the blood of their colleagues. The hostages are taken at gunpoint and locked into the back of the vehicle. A little further down the street, another man, a former soldier from the South African National Defence Force, hears the gunshots and bravely runs towards the station. His selfless actions, however, are to no avail, as he is gunned down by the assailants as they make their escape, hostages and stolen guns in hand. At the same time as this is all going on, a nearby ATM is being bombed. Now, I must tell you that there are two wildly different versions of this ATM story, and I haven't been able to establish which one is true. Some media reports say that the same group went from the police station to the ATM, while others say that this happened simultaneously and that the attack on the station was a distraction or cover for the ATM bombing. The majority of reports suggest the latter, but I want to be clear that there is still quite a lot of confusion about it. Either way, as the new day dawned on Ngcobo, 6 people have been fatally shot, 4 around the station, including our army man and 2 other officers, the drivers of the police van that the gunmen had pulled up in. On this point too, there is some uncertainty. Some news sources report that 2 police officers were taken from the station in a police van, had their hands tied behind their heads, and then were shot, execution style, outside the high school. Others report testimony from one of the gunmen where he states that they first hijacked a police car on patrol and then headed to the station, having murdered the occupants. And yes, that is a bit of a spoiler. I said testimony because some of the perpetrators were caught really quickly after these events took place. But that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, right? Chances are, if you shoot up a police station, the police are going to be looking for you with a vengeance. In fact, the police chief at the time declared to media that they would have had the suspects in hand within 72 hours. In actuality, it was just 65, a mere 2.5 days later, that the police managed to track down the supposed killers after a tip-off that they were hiding out at the Seven Angels church compound. Now, just to go on a brief tangent here, if you've listened to some of my previous episodes, you'll be aware that 65 hours is a flat-out record time for the South African police to turn anything around, let alone a multiple murder case. But clearly, there's some additional incentive in here. The police mobilize a task force immediately, and on the night of the 23rd of Feb, they head over to the Mancoba compound. Initially, the plan was to raid the church and apprehend the gunmen, but things quickly devolved into a straight-out gunfight. One that this time, though, the police were ready for. Residents of the area later report that the shooting went on for some 30 minutes before the police managed to fully storm the compound and get their men. In that time, 7 members of the church were gunned down, including 3 of the Mancoba brothers, for whom the church is named. When the shooting is done, 10 people are arrested. But now the compound is a crime scene, and the police and later press finally get insight into the workings of this mysterious group, how big it had become, and what really went on behind the fences. And this is where we're starting to get into who these people were, besides apparently crazed but motivated shooters. After the raid, the police remove around 100 young women and girls from the site, many of them underaged, some as young as 12, and some with children of their own. Their accommodations in the compound are cramped, tin shacks with multiple mattresses spread over the floor, clothes hanging off wires suspended across the room. They have lived here, like this, pretty much every day since joining or being born into the church. and forbidden from going into school or socializing outside of the compound's bounds, as these actions were considered mortal sins. These kind of revelations, for lack of a better word, I regret that one, these findings sparked a media frenzy about Ngcobo's crazed sex cult, I think the media were calling it, and it soon became national knowledge that the church is run by 7 brothers, the Mancobas, or as they would have it, 7 angels, who have been apparently very busy keeping this host of underaged girls as their, giant quotation marks here, wives, and just generally extorting money and goods from their deluded and or captive congregation. The Mancobas, we learn, have become sort of a religious dynasty. The origins of their church start with Siphiwo Mancoba, a self-styled pastor who started a church called Angel Ministry in 1986 in Umzimkhulu in KwaZulu-Natal, or just Natal as it would have been back then. Siphiwo is an enterprising sort who records his lectures and teachings and distributes these to his followers, instructing them to go out and spread the word, recruiting new members. According to some pretty excellent reporting from the Daily Dispatch, Siphiwo was originally in partnership with another patriarch of a church family, a man called Ndumiso Jali. Siphiwo started referring to himself as the new Moses, and together they made a good living fleecing the congregation of whatever they would give them. But it was Ndumiso's land that Angel Ministry started on, and when the 2 men almost inevitably fell out over the use of that land and the use of the proceeds from their church, Siphiwo was kicked out. The hostility between these two ended in a fight that saw Siphiwo killed. The brothers, all grown men by this point, decided to decamp back to Ngcobo, where they had had success early on, and establish a new church, the Seven Angels Ministry, with their mother, Noluvo Mancoba, as figurehead. As part of starting their new church, the brothers told the story they proclaimed that they were on a crusade to fight Lucifer, the fallen angel himself. Except that their version of fighting the devil looked a lot like their father's legacy of taking whatever of value that their congregants had to offer. To join the church, members were expected to sign over all their worldly wealth, including cars, cash, and properties, given over as gifts to the brothers. As cults go, that's not terribly inventive, I know. In fact, it's pretty textbook. You've got insular community with absolute leaders who are in it for the power, profit, and we'd learn sexual exploitation. Now remember I said to put a pin in the matter of what the police did to look into the church before the massacre. Well, they did and they didn't take steps. Many people in the Ngcobo community had actually reported the Mancoba ministry to various authorities. They were concerned because people they cared about had quit their jobs, cashed in their pensions, and moved into the space never to be seen again. Now, some members were sometimes sent out to beg or preach, and when people encountered them in the wild, so to speak, they would hear, as Meliswa told us, that the children in the compound were being kept from school. In 2016, a team of police and social workers actually removed 21 children from the premises and took them into state care. At the time, they alerted the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Communities. That's a mouthful, I know, but they go by the acronym CRL, and basically they protect the rights of minority religious and cultural communities, which is a pretty important mission in a country as diverse as South Africa. the CRL Commission investigated the Seven Angels Church, and this is where things get infuriating. Because the CRL actually conducted lengthy interviews with the brothers, including Banele Mancoba, the de facto leader and church spokesperson. What he had to say raised a lot of red flags, and honestly, if you get a chance to go and watch that interview, which you can find online, and I will link, please do so, because it's a lot, it's very odd, and in short, Banele claimed that the Mancoba brothers were not human, but rather angels sitting at the right hand of Jesus, sent to earth, as I've explained, to hunt Lucifer. So far, so predictable, right? Except that Banele goes on to explain that Lucifer had a hand in the development of the South African Constitution, and he had his claws in the education system. This made those two things completely intolerable for the Mancoba ministry. Most bizarrely, he casually mentions their belief that Nelson Mandela himself had helped Satan to achieve this influence. It also seems that some of the more progressive elements of our constitution were what really pained the Seven Angels Ministry. The fact that under South African law, gay women and men can marry, for example, or, ironically, the fact that the Constitution makes provision for religious freedoms for all belief systems, a lot of which Banele dismissed out of hand as, quote, witchcraft. Naturally, he implied, these matters left the Seven Angels no choice but to stop all of the children in their group from attending school, and to isolate their members as much as possible, freeing them and protecting them from the tendrils of moral corruption that were basically everywhere. Now, you probably think I'm going to tell you that the CRL committee slept on this information, but they didn't. The chairperson, who was present at the interviews, immediately reached out to Parliament, asking for an amendment to her mandate that would allow her to close the church down. It was, in her opinion, a ticking time bomb. She even predicted that it was only a matter of them running out of money before everything would implode. Despite these dire warnings, the parliamentary committee ruled they couldn't give the CRL that kind of power, and then they proceeded to do, well, absolutely bugger all else about this very dangerous cult that their attention had been drawn to. Because, these things often work themselves out. So you can see that there had been some action, but mostly at a local police level, which may be why, or at least I'm surmising, that that's why the police had become the targets when, forgive the pun, all hell broke loose in February 2018. Oh, incidentally, there was perhaps another precursor to that deadly night, something that's only been linked after the fact. Again, I have the in-depth reporting of the Daily Dispatch, and specifically Bongani Fuzile, to thank for this one. You see, 2 weeks before the shootouts in Ngcobo, Ndumiso Jali and his wife, Noma India Jali, were shot and murdered in their church in New Clydesdale, Umzimkhulu. And it was, Bongani writes, the Mancoba brothers who showed up to demand the body of their father's partner turned nemesis. With all of these bits of information coming together, we start to see a picture emerging of what life was probably like in the compound around then. There was this growing congregation. They were literally breeding more members. But at the same time, they had a problem of dwindling recruits who are used to provide new money, because no one in the compound works or goes outside. And those recruits are dwindling, especially because the word got around that you had to give up all of your wealth to join. And at the driver's wheel of this mess were these narcissistic con men operating a little bit like the mob, convinced of their superiority, fueled by bigotry, resentful of the local police, entitled, and honestly emboldened by the state's lack of action against them. They started to target their enemies. If we think that they believed their own hype or law, maybe they saw Mdumisojali and the police as agents of evil who stood in their way. If you take a more cynical view, as I think we all know I do, I think that they saw these victims as convenient, a source of money, guns, and revenge. And that is what I believe led directly to the deaths in February 2018. As I mentioned earlier, 3 of the people shot dead by police during the raid were Mancoba brothers. 2 more brothers were among those arrested, including Banele and Putumile. Banele was charged with rape, sexual grooming, and sexual abuse. Putumile was charged for possessing an unlicensed firearm. Neither of them could be implicated directly in the police murders of the 21st of Feb, and Banele and his cohort went so far as to blame the whole thing on Thandazile Mancoba, who conveniently had been shot dead in the police raid, along with Xolisa and Pelile Mancoba. Convenient only in that the scapegoat could not be interrogated after the fact. The shooting was over, but the mess left behind is still being unravelled. When they were threatened and attacked, this little village police force and its backup had responded with force, not precision, so prosecuting this case has been a nightmare. Somehow, the surviving brothers, 4 of them, all ended up essentially scot-free. In Benele's case, this was despite the fact that he admitted to having what he called a wife in the compound who would have been just 15 years old when they married, and who was the mother to his 2-year-old child. Somehow, both this and the fact that he headed up a cult where multiple young women and girls were forcibly kept was not enough for the National Prosecuting Authority to proceed with the case against him. Some 40 women and children were questioned regarding their treatment at the compound, with police and social workers believing that they had been raped and molested. It seems that all women in the compound were considered sexually available to the brothers. The children born into the cult were never registered with the state, so they were without ID numbers or birth certificates. The majority of the women declined to provide information to the prosecutors, to the police, and many requested to be returned to the church. The Mancoba family have largely dodged legal consequences, though the church compound itself has been demolished and the mountain graffiti removed. Their mother is still proclaiming the innocence of her dead sons in the press, but we will never have an opportunity to really test that in a court of law. So instead of the leaders, the blame for the 2018 events, at least in the legal sense, is sitting squarely on the shoulders of 5 other church members, all arrested on the night of the shootout, all still working their way through the legal system 3 long years later. Well, almost 4 years later. They are Andani, sometimes called Andile, Monko, Sipho Somizi Trefu, Kwanele Ndlwana, Siposikle Tatsi, and Pumzile Nhlatwa. Brother Putumile Mancoba was convicted of defeating the ends of justice and the illegal possession of one of the firearms stolen from the police station, but the multiple murder cases have been delayed repeatedly, and all of the accused except Putumile have turned down legal representation, which has really complicated matters, because the accused have tied the courts up with a trial within a trial for literal years, arguing that their confessions of guilt are not actually admissible because they claim that the police tortured the admissions out of them. One claimed he was beaten to the point of blacking out and soiling himself, suffocated with an inner tube of a tire, and even forced to drink urine. Accusations being levelled at the same police officers that participated in the arrest and subsequent questioning of the Mancoba church members. In 2020, Mthatha Judge Robert Griffiths, the presiding judge in this case, implored the police to use, quote, modern technology, like voice and video recording, during investigation and interrogation, saying that this would have helped both the SAPS and the court and save time in court proceedings by avoiding this whole case within a case situation. No shit. Look, if you're South African, you probably know how poorly equipped the police can be with their paper files and handwritten documents. And that's in the bigger cities, like Cape Town and Johannesburg. So we can only imagine the state of investigations in underserved, understaffed rural stations, especially when a shitshow like this lands on them. So yes, we despair, but we are not surprised that in the 2020s, a judge has to remind the cops to record their damn proceedings. You feel for the cops, but you also want to shake them, or at least I do. I know that they lost colleagues and friends, but I also wouldn't be surprised if they had responded without the necessary care and restraint. The upshot of all of this mess is that in 2022, the families that lost loved ones in the Ngcobo community are still waiting for justice. And we know so little about the victims, about what actually went down, about the investigation, that I don't know how that justice will ever be served. But I can tell you their names. So, those killed were Warrant Officer Zuko Mbini, Constable Zuko Ncheku, Constable Nkosiphendule Pongo, Constable Siboseni Sandlana, and Constable Kuhle Metete. The brave soldier who ran towards the sound of gunfire was Freddie Mpandeni. 4 years on, this case is still a mess and there are so many unknowns, and it's very frustrating. I don't know that these victims will ever see the justice they deserve. And that's, I guess, why you've sat through a 40-minute rant from me. But I'm wrapping up. So to lighten our spirits, after all of that, I thought I'd give the last word back to Millie. I asked her what she wished to tell you, or anyone else, about this little village with the bad reputation that she loves so much.
I wish we had less crime. And I also wish that there was more growth and more opportunity, because I feel like it's a great town. It's got lots of people that have done amazing things. It's amazing thing that's got a beautiful history, and it's got great nature and hills and mountains and things for people to explore. It's just that it's so tainted with all the what I told you about the place of thieves from when we were children, which has just perpetuated itself over and over and over the years. And whenever good things does come from Ngcobo, it's like it's always marred by all the bad and all the ugly and all the thieving and everything. So I just wish that we could change the narrative a little bit. And I do try with my posts and stuff, but it's little. It doesn't go a long way.